Welcome to video 3.1, Sampling Methods and Issues. So this is coming from our experimental design unit, and I want to warn you, this unit is very vocabulary heavy, and not all of it is being covered here. So you want to be sure that you have other options. There's a lot of study cards that are already out there to help you with this, that you really want to pay attention to this. So be sure to study these. The vocab for this unit, I have some study cards. So just be forewarned, this cannot possibly cover everything in this unit. All right, so what we're going to talk about is I have a question about high school students who ride the bus. I want to ask a sample. Okay, so that's our scenario. So with our sampling methods, there's some good sampling methods and there's some bad sampling methods. So our population for this question is going to be all high school students. And so this is our population cloud. And we're going to sample out of this population cloud. So there's some good ones here and some bad ones here. So I want to list. So first I want to talk about is the convenience sample. Now the convenience sample is not a good choice because it is not representative of the population. With a convenience sample, you're going to pick those because it's not representative because you're picking those that are convenient, whoever they are. It doesn't look like the population because it's not representative. So here's what I'm showing. Here's the population. They look like a cloud. Our convenience sample does not look like that cloud. It's not being represented. So a problem that you can have with a convenience sample is you can have an under coverage or an over coverage. So if I wanted to know about people who ride the school bus, high school students who ride the school bus to school, and I asked my first period AP stats class, I'm probably going to have an under coverage because a large number of you are seniors who drive. So I wouldn't have an accurate representation of high school students who ride the bus. The other one that we can have that does not look like the population is a voluntary response sample. It doesn't look like a convenience sample, so I used a different shape on it. When you have a voluntary response sample, there is no selection of subjects. Anyone can participate. So that's like a radio phone-in show where it's like, hey, give us a call if you want. You're not being selected to call. Anybody can call. Voting is a voluntary response. You're not selected to vote. You choose whether or not you go vote. Everybody who's of the proper age is allowed to vote, and then you're choosing whether or not you go. Okay. So your voluntary, that's your participant choice if participating. Okay, so those are two sampling methods that we don't want to use. What we do want to use is a simple random sample. That's our best method. So I'm going to make it look like the population, because what's nice about a simple random sample is it is representative of the population. And the reason that's really important is we can generalize the results to the population. All right, so that makes our survey much more interesting if I could generalize. I took the survey and now I can generalize it to all high school students. Okay. Now, how do we do an SRS? This is important. The first thing you need to do is label the participants. So we're either going to number them or we're going to put them in alphabetical order. Some way we're going to label these participants. Put them in alphabetical order and then number them by some methodology is a really good way to label participants. Then we're going to randomize them somehow. So we could do things like a random number generator. You could roll dice. You could pull slips of paper from a hat. Just some examples of how we've randomized. Okay. Slips of paper from a hat is like the most classic simple random sample. Everybody's in there and we're drawing out of it. And then the last part is to select. Somehow we're going to select. Now, that brings me to my first AP tip that I want to point out. If we're sampling without replacement, we're pulling an individual out and keeping them out, you want to make sure when you make your selection that you use the words ignore repeats to say we're not going to be resampling the same people over and over and over. That's a good way to lose some points if you don't include that. So be sure you include ignore repeats. All right, so there's some issues that we could run into even if we have good sampling. So even with good sampling, bad things can happen. So some of the issues are under coverage, and under coverage, to remind you, is those who should be included are not. So in our example, if I sent this survey out about riding the bus, and I sent it out by email to the high school students, those without a computer to get the email or on their phone, if they don't have it on their phone, won't receive the survey, and so their opinions are not being represented. So I wanted to include them, and I sent everything out, but they weren't included, and so that can lead to some different issues. Another problem that we could get is a non-response. And a non-response is those who were selected did not respond. Now let me do a little comparison here. Non-response is we selected somebody, sent them the survey, they didn't send it back. That is different than voluntary response. There's no selection of subjects in a voluntary response. Anyone can participate. It's just put out there. If you want to, you can. If you don't, you don't. As opposed to I asked you to and you didn't respond to it. Okay, so non-response is you're part of the group and you did not respond. And the third thing that we can run into, even with good sampling, is a response bias. And that can be as simple as the participants are untruthful, and maybe they're not intentionally untruthful. Maybe they just don't remember an answer, and so they reported a wrong number or something. So in our case, maybe the student's embarrassed about riding the bus because they hate it so much. And so they just say, nope, I don't ride the bus, when in fact they do. That would be a response bias because they told us an answer that didn't match what was actually going on. All right, now we want to dive down into a stratified sample versus a cluster, because we had some issues with that during when we were doing this unit the original time, and I want to make sure we cover that. So when we're talking about stratified, what we're really wanting to look at is there a characteristic? So what characteristic would have an effect on our response? Okay, so in this case, in our question's about who rides the school bus, the age of the student would make a really big difference. So we can break down our sample by making a stratified random sample. So when you stratify, you are breaking your groups, a whole population, down on some like characteristic. So I'm going to do kind of a pictorial comparison, and then we're going to make a comparison over here about the differences between stratified and cluster. So I'm going to kind of draw this line. So I'm going to have the pictorial comparison, and then we'll do some more lining up. So here we have our little population cloud. That's all high school students. Okay, from there, for a stratified, so this is stratified, we're going to take all of these high school students and we're going to break them into groups. So I'm going to have one group here. That's going to be my freshmen. And then I'm going to have my next group from my cloud. That's going to be my sophomores. Then I'm going to have my next group from my cloud. That's going to be my juniors. And then I'm going to have my last group from my cloud. That's my seniors. So I got these 4 groups now. Once I have everybody into their group, I want to then take an SRS out of that group. So I have all these freshmen. So from here, I'm going to sample an SRS of freshmen. And then with my sophomores, I'll do the same thing. I have my whole group of sophomores. So within that group, I'm going to take an SRS. And then my juniors, I'm going to take an SRS from just the juniors. And then finally our seniors, we'll take an SRS from them also. That way I've got all the groups represented. And this, where I did all those SRSs, that's my sample. That's what I'm going to use to find out my information. Okay, so once we've pulled this SRS, we're going to talk or ask, whichever we're doing, only to those in the SRS. All right. So one way I described this when we were talking about it in class is we're broken into layers, and then we're selecting out of the layers. So I had used the term lasagna here. It's kind of like a lasagna. Okay. Now, let's talk about our clusters. For our cluster, we're going to make little mini populations. So let me write that, mini populations. And so what I mean like that is here I broke into just freshmen, but here I'm going to make another, it's a baby cloud that looks just like the population cloud. It's got all the same mixture of people. I'll make another baby cloud, and it's got all the same mixture as the population. Another baby cloud of people, and it's so these clusters look like the population. So we just got a whole bunch of clusters that we made. We broke people into groups that look like the population. Okay. So now we have all these clusters. So what I'm going to do with the cluster is I'm going to randomly select a cluster. I would have numbered them and used a random number generator. I would have done something to randomly select here and say this cluster comes out, and we'll have this cluster got picked in my random selection. And then we had one last cluster that got picked. This guy got picked right here. So these three clusters that got picked, they're my sample. So this is my sample here. And in that sample, we're going to talk to every single person inside the cluster. We're not sampling out of the clusters. Talk to everyone in cluster. Okay. So, when we were talking about this in class, I used the term soup for this. So you have a big pot of soup and you have a ladle, and you pull the ladle and you get a representative scoop of the soup and put it in a bowl, and you fill all the bowls, and then you choose to eat 3 of the bowls and you'll eat all of the soup in the bowl. So that is a cluster. You're going to talk to every single person in the groups that you pulled, but you're going to create smaller baby populations from a bigger population. Okay, so hopefully that kind of helped clarify that a little bit. So when we make our stratified random sample, you're concerned about these groups and their age. So our AP tip for this is going to be about that. When you're making a stratified random sample, you're concerned about whatever this characteristic is. So you're going to create a strata based on a variable that is most strongly associated with the response variable. In this case, we were worried about their age, and so we broke it up into year in school, because there's less freshmen driving than seniors, so it's kind of important what group they're from. So then we took a sample from each of the groups and then talked to those people in the sample. In our cluster, we made little baby-looking populations. They represent the population, but they're just smaller groups. And then we just picked a number of them and then talked to everybody in the sample. So when you're having a question and you're trying to decide, is this stratified or is this a cluster? Did they take an SRS and talk to only a few of the people, or did they talk to everybody in the cluster, in the thing that they picked? And that's a pretty good clue to help you differentiate between those two things. All right, so let's wrap this up and just kind of do a little comparison between a stratified random sample and a cluster. So in a stratified, you're going to split your population into groups. You do the same thing in a cluster. We're going to split this into groups also. Now, these groups are not the same, but they are a similar idea. So they both have you split into groups. Here's where it gets different. In a stratified random sample, when you split into group, you're putting all the same characteristic together. So that's what we're going to call homogeneous. Homogeneous means the same. When we have a cluster, the people within the group, the split that you made, they're going to be heterogeneous. That means they're different. Okay, so in a stratified, they're all the same. In a cluster, they're all different. Once we have our homogeneous group, we're going to take an SRS within the group. For our cluster, we're going to take an SRS of an entire group. Okay, so that's your key words here. we're going to SRS with our stratified and talk to only those in the SRS. And in the cluster, we're going to talk to the entire group. They're being picked as one. So in these two, homogeneous and SRS within a group versus heterogeneous and SRS of an entire group, this is where the two are different from each other. All right, hopefully that was helpful to you. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in class.